For any individual company, it's often in their interest to sell technology to China.
Yes.
But across a wide set of technology companies, it's often dangerous for them all to sell technology to China.
So which leads to the kind of ecosystem of Japan, Netherlands, and US.
Those three countries are fairly aligned. They present a very powerful bloc.
So some people say that chips or semiconductors are the oil of the 21st century. Do you agree with this?
We're all used to thinking about Saudi Arabia as having this huge importance in the global economy because it produces 10 or 15% of the world's oil. But Taiwan produces 90% of the world's most advanced processors.
はい、ピボットの竹下です。今日はですね、半導体戦争という本を書いた、これ素晴らしい本なんですけど、クリス・ミラーさんにつながっています。マサチューセッツ州に在住なんですけど、タフツ大学の、准教授でいらしてですね、この半導体、本当に21世紀の石油と言われている超重要、テクノロジーについてですね、聞いてみたいと思います。この半導体をめぐっては、台湾がですね、本当に重要なテクノロジーの9割を占めているということなので、非常に重要なので、今後の台湾有事とかにも関わってくると思いますし、なぜ今中国がこれほどアメリカおよび日本と対立を深めているのかという謎も解けると思います。半導体なくしては今後のビジネスを考えられないということなので、早速クリスさんにつないでみます。So Chris Miller, the author of Chip Wars, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I want to start the conversation by taking a passage from your book. You mentioned that we rarely think about chips, yet they've created the modern world. What do you mean by that? How did chips create the modern world?
Well, today, most people don't ever think about semiconductors. We just rely on them for almost every aspect of our modern lives. It's not only your smartphone or your computer, it's data centers that process and store all of our data. It's the telecoms network, it's automobiles, it's medical devices, it's dishwashers, it's refrigerators. Today, it's hard to find anything that doesn't have at least one and often dozens or hundreds of semiconductors inside. And that's why the modern economy can't work without them, as we learned during the pandemic when chip shortages caused huge disruptions. So we've got to take semiconductors more seriously today because we rely on them for almost every aspect of our lives.
I was also surprised that out of the most advanced chips, 90% are manufactured in Taiwan. So what's the impact of having such a small island concentrated on semiconductors?
Well, it is an extraordinary fact. Most people have no idea that 90% of the most advanced processors are made not only in one country, Taiwan, but by one company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And the most advanced chips are not only used in niche applications. They're in your smartphone, they're in your computer, they're in the chips inside of the data centers that process and remember all of your data. So everyone uses the most advanced chips on a regular basis. And the concentration in manufacturing of the most advanced chips has raised questions about whether that's a good way to organize the industry, both in case of natural disasters, but also because of the growing Chinese threat to Taiwan's security. And so this has sparked lots of interest in many countries, Europe, Japan, the US, about trying to find ways to diversify the manufacturing base of advanced semiconductors.
Yeah, so why did this happen? Was Taiwan, where they had smart engineers, or their strategy of the foundry system was good, or why did this happen?
Well, there's certainly smart engineers in Taiwan, but there's smart engineers in many countries.
Yes.
I think the key differentiating fact was the foundry model. And so in 1987, which is when TSMC was founded, at that time, every company both designed and manufactured semiconductors in-house. And the founder of TSMC, Morris Chang, had a really revolutionary business idea. His goal was to not design any chips, only to manufacture them so that he could serve a large number of customers. And so today, Apple, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, many of the world's largest chip companies don't actually do any manufacturing. They rely on TSMC to make the most important chips that they depend on.
So some people say that chips or semiconductors are the oil of the 21st century. So I have several questions related to this topic. First of all, do you agree with this statement, or is there a difference between oil and semiconductors?
Well, I think there are two differences that I would highlight. One is that it's relatively easy to produce oil if you find it underground. And that's why many different countries, from Nigeria to Saudi Arabia to Canada, have produced oil. It's all about the geology, not that much about technological expertise, whereas chips are different. There's no natural resource that has made Taiwan the world's leading chip maker. It's all about the business model and the scientific expertise. But the second thing, which is really, I think, even more striking, is that there's a lot more concentration in the chip industry than the oil industry. We're all used to thinking about Saudi Arabia as having this huge importance in the global economy because it produces 10 or 15% of the world's oil. But Taiwan produces 90% of the world's most advanced processor chips. So there's even more concentration here than there is in the oil market.
That's right. Saudi Arabia doesn't produce 90% of oil, so that's a huge difference.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And we've all come to realize the political importance that Saudi Arabia's oil production has, but most people are totally unaware of the political importance that Taiwan's central role in the chip industry has given Taiwan.
So that leads to a couple of questions. So first of all, so given that fact that 90% of important materials are produced in Taiwan, does that give China excuse or likelihood for them to invade Taiwan, even the risks?
Well, I don't think Taiwan has needed any excuses because it's been the goal of Chinese government policy to try to take control of Taiwan since 1949. The only reason that China hasn't done that is because they haven't been able to. The U.S. has said it would defend Taiwan using all of the power at its disposal. I think it's also the case that if China were to attack Taiwan or to blockade Taiwan, the result wouldn't be that China would get control of the facilities. It would just destroy the facilities because these are the most sensitive and complex facilities requiring an international supply chain, materials, software, expertise regularly imported from Japan, from the US, from Europe. And so there's really no easy way that China could simply take the facilities. But I do worry that if China decides to move on Taiwan for its own reasons, unrelated to semiconductors, it could, in the process, destroy facilities that the rest of the world completely depends on.
So it's very different from a nation to invade a country and take over the oil field. It's completely different.
That's right. That's right. I think it's almost impossible for China to invade and get the chip making facilities intact because you need not only the facilities themselves, you need all the engineers. The critical knowledge is in the heads of the engineers who have unique capabilities to operate tooling, to design and manufacture chips. And so without the people, you simply can't operate the chip making facilities.
I recently read an interview of, not an interview, but a news story about an NVIDIA founder CEO, Jensen Huang. He said that the resources China is dedicating to its chip industry are quite massive, so you cannot underestimate them. So that leads to my question about, can China produce semiconductors or chips similar to Taiwan? Can they catch up with Taiwan?
Well, they're certainly trying to catch up. And Jensen Huang is correct that China is spending tens of billions of dollars a year and has been spending money along those lines for the past decade. Thus far, they've made some progress in getting closer to the cutting edge, but they're still quite far behind when it comes to many parts of the semiconductor supply chain. And the key thing to realize about semiconductors is it's not only about making the chips, it's about designing them, it's about accessing the machine tools that are necessary for chip making. And so across the supply chain, China's a small player. Today, it's the case that you simply can't make an advanced semiconductor without tools, software, equipment, materials from Japan, from the US, from the Netherlands, primarily. And China is a small player in the rest of the supply chain. So China's has a long way to go before it can reach self-sufficiency. And although it is making some progress, the rest of the industry is making progress as well. Every year, TSMC rolls out a new manufacturing process that is dramatically better than the prior version. And so even if China makes some incremental progress, if the rest of the world is still racing ahead, the gap between China and Taiwan, for example, will persist.
Right. The TMC is building a factory in Japan, Kumamoto. So they're expanding their eco chain.
That's absolutely right. And it's Kumamoto. It's also in Arizona in the US. And then they recently announced a new plant in Germany as well. And so this is a sign that TSMC is trying to bring production online in other locations, responding to the demands of some of their customers.
Interesting. So you're saying that in order to create semiconductors or chips, you need chemicals or machines or tools or designers. So which leads to the kind of an ecosystem of Japan, Netherlands, and US. So do you think that it's interesting that those countries are, equivalent of the so-called like-minded countries, democratic countries. In other words, rivals of China. So do you think the team or the framework of these countries is very important to compete with China? Or can China create another framework to compete with the so-called Western world or the like-minded countries?
Well, I think it is quite important that you have those three countries fairly aligned when it comes to semiconductor policy. They've each, over the past year, issued a new set of export controls that ban the transfer of certain types of advanced machine tools to China. I think they have a pretty similar view of the challenge that China poses, both in economic terms, but also in security terms. And so long as those three countries are fairly aligned, they present a very powerful bloc because they've got an almost complete monopoly today on the key machine tools. I think if there are gaps that open up between them over time, that could be quite impactful. And so it'll be very important to watch whether those three countries stay aligned or whether, because of domestic political changes in any one of them, their agreement begins to decline over time. And if so, that would present an opening for China.
So I can imagine that the three countries, at least at the government level, they can be aligned together to compete with China. But at the same time, these are private companies involved. And so our publication PIVOT, we interview a lot of CEOs and private companies, and their motivation is also about business. So, and some companies have relationships with China. So how can we keep the CEOs together and keep aligned in order to keep the economic security? Because their motivation is to, make money.
That's right. And I think that's got to be a critical part of the strategy that Japan, that the US, and the Netherlands are promoting. They want to protect certain technologies, but do so in a way that limits the cost to their own firms. Because government officials in all three of those countries realize that if they hurt their own firms, they're going to hurt the institutions that are capable of investing in next generation technologies. And as a result, will slow the rate of technological advance. So there's been a whole lot of steps taken by each of those governments to design these controls in a way that is as low cost as possible. Now, certainly companies aren't happy with any restrictions, but I think I've been relatively impressed by the extent to which governments have tried to carefully design the restrictions to limit the cost to companies. And the other aspect is that companies themselves face a very complex calculus when it comes to the Chinese market. For any individual company, it's often in their interest to sell technology to China.
Yes.
But across a wide set of technology companies, it's often dangerous for them all to sell technology to China, because if China is able to build up competitors, China will stop buying their products. We've seen this in the auto industry, for example. China used to be one of the world's largest auto importers. Now it's the world's largest auto exporter, not because of the decision of any one company, but because China was able to move up the value chain, acquire new technological capabilities, and is now challenging major industry players like Volkswagen and Toyota. I think that's the risk in semiconductors. And when it comes to the way CEOs think about it, they can be individually rational, trying to sell as much for their company, but collectively irrational if the net effect is to create more powerful, more capable competitors in China.
Do you think we need more restrictions or maybe economical benefits, or should we just keep it up to the CEOs and their kind of ethics? What can we do to make the alignment more stronger?
Well, I think governments have decided that they needed more restrictions, which is why you've seen all of the controls of the last year rolled out. I think governments have also been trying not only to be restrictive, but also to be supportive. And that's why in Europe, in Japan, in the US, there's been a number of policies designed to promote the semiconductor industry, new research funding, for example, new incentives to build new fabs. So in Japan, the government, for example, has helped fund a new TSMC facility. It's also injecting large sums of money into a new semiconductor maker called Rapidus. This is evidence of the government trying to find ways to support industry as well as simultaneously restricting the ability to sell to certain customers in China.
Right. So in the international discourse these days, terms such as Indo-Pacific or Quad or economic security are commonly used, which are kind of coined by the Japanese government or Shinzo Abe. So what can Japanese business sectors or the government sector can play a role in this chip war?
Well, I think actually, if you look at the direction the chip war has taken, many of the key themes have, in fact, been devised and crafted by Japanese policymakers. I think if you look at the strategy to hold China back from the cutting edge, but to continue selling less advanced tools to China, that's something that has been supported and in some ways even, I think, devised by Japanese policymakers. I think also the strategy to try to shift supply chains by building up new capacity in Vietnam, in India, in Thailand, that's also something that Japanese policymakers have been very early to promote. Ultimately, I think the collective strategy that's emerged is one that has gotten the most headlines when it comes to cutting edge technologies, but is actually just as important when it comes to lagging edge technologies across the supply chain. And that's where countries like Vietnam, like India, will play a big role, not because they're going to be producing cutting edge capabilities, but because they're going to provide the new assembly base and packaging base for less sophisticated capabilities. And identifying these supply chain challenges and identifying India and Japan, India and Vietnam in particular as solutions, that's something that Japanese policymakers have played a very large role in.
I see. How about Japanese business leaders? What roles can they play?
Well, I think business leaders from every country have been struggling to catch up to this new reality, trying to understand how far will this decoupling go, in what ways supply chains will shift, and how to manage these changes in a way that is cost effective, because ultimately business leaders need to both be cognizant of the political realities, but also cognizant of their bottom line and cost considerations. And so I think Japanese business leaders, like business leaders in the US and Korea and Taiwan, have been struggling to strike this balance over the past several years as the politics and regulatory environment has changed so rapidly, and yet the demand for cost efficiency remains.
So I want to go back, take our conversation back to Taiwan being the leader of chip wars. So in your book, you mentioned about Akio Morita, the founder of Sony, and maybe 10 or 20 years ago, Intel used to be the leaders of this industry. So what happened to Sony or Intel? Did they miss the boat, or why is suddenly Taiwan the frontliner of semiconductor industry?
Well, I think for both the Japanese and the US chip industry, there were a couple of things that were missed. When it comes to the Japanese chip industry, it peaked in terms of its importance in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And at the time, the Japanese chip industry was very large in volume sold, but was actually pretty limited in terms of profitability. And there were many Japanese firms competing both with US firms, but also against each other. And so the business model just never made sense. You could win market share, but you could never make much money. And that was a business model possible to sustain for a number of years. But after a certain point, it just became too expensive. And business leaders decided to exit those markets, which is why today the world's largest producer of memory chips, the type of chip that Japanese firms once specialized in, are actually Korean. Because there was no money to be made by Japanese producers. And that speaks to the central importance of business model. That's the exact same problem, actually, that Intel has recently faced. Intel, since its founding, has both designed and manufactured chips itself. It missed the shift to split design for manufacturing that TSMC pioneered. And it's been struggling to catch up since then. Now it's got a new CEO, Pat Gelsinger, who's trying to move more towards a TSMC style business model. But that again speaks to the absolutely central importance of business model next to technological expertise, next to engineering acumen, you've got to have a business model that's viable in order to compete in this industry.
How about Google, Amazon, and people call it Magnificent Seven these days? Who will be the winners and the losers in this world?
Well, all of the big cloud computing firms right now are trying to design their own chips. They're all in the process of doing so. Some have actually rolled out use of their chips in large scale, but they're all also finding themselves fundamentally on NVIDIA for access to the GPUs on which they're training many of their most advanced AI systems. And so I think cloud computing firms right now are facing somewhat of an inflection point. They were hoping to be able to move away from reliance on Intel, which produced most of the type of chips that previously were at the center of data centers, towards their own silicon. And now it turns out that they're not going to be able to move from Intel to their own silicon. They're moving from Intel to NVIDIA, which is able to charge very high prices because they've got an almost monopolistic position in the production of GPUs that this current wave of AI depends on. And so actually, we've seen NVIDIA reach $1 trillion valuation, roughly the size of many of the companies that you mentioned, precisely because its chips will be so important to the current wave of AI.
Tell me more about the impact of AI. Do you think chips will be more critical in the future?
Well, absolutely. And what we see with the development of AI over the last 10 years or so is that the key ingredient that has made AI cost effective is we've got access to more computing power thanks to better semiconductors. We've certainly got smarter algorithms. We've got more specific data for certain use cases, but processing power, computing power has been at the center of our advances. And I think that's not going to change for a very long time. Now we've got two challenges. One is to keep improving processing power in data centers where big systems are trained. But we've also got a separate problem of developing more advanced chips for inference, especially on the edge of networks, like in cars or in smartphones, where there's more demand for chips that are energy efficient, that are more rapid, lower cost. And that's going to require a new set of technologies, probably some of which will be provided by existing firms, but some of which might be provided by new startups that don't yet exist.
Also, you're an expert in Russia. So how does Russia take part in this chip war?
Well, they take part primarily by having lost the first round of the chip war. During the Cold War arms race, Russia tried to be a big player. They poured lots of money into the chip industry, but because they never globalized properly, and because they never developed effective business models, they fell far, far behind, even though they had a pretty big domestic market and lots of very smart physicists. That wasn't enough without a sustainable business model.
So I also want to ask you about the future of economic security. What kind of discussions people are having in the United States about economic security and their impact in U.S.-China relationship?
Well, I think actually the key question is probably not what happens next in U.S. policy, but what happens next in Chinese policy. Because I think the U.S. has actually been quite reactive to China. It was China that in 2014 identified semiconductors as what Xi Jinping calls a core technology. And it wasn't for 8 more years that the U.S. passed the CHIPS Act. So the chronology has been that China acts, and then after a pretty long delay, the U.S. responds. And I think here too, that will be critical. My guess is that China is going to keep pushing towards more import substitution. In other words, forcing Chinese consumers and companies to buy more locally made chips and locally made components. And insofar as China goes down that route, that will push forward the bifurcation of supply chains because it will cut off the Chinese market from being sold to by foreign providers, including U.S. firms. And insofar as China chooses that route, I think it implies more bifurcation, more decoupling across the electronics and computing industry.
So what would be our strategy? Do you think we should keep, I know it's important to keep the alliance between Europe, Japan, the United States, and Taiwan, but what other strategies can we take? Because it seems to me that China is starting to improve their ability to create or produce chips, and they might overcome Taiwan in the near future, or 10 or 20 years from now.
Well, I think I think you're right to be concerned about that. And that's why technological leadership is so critical. You know, there's not a single chip that China buys today from abroad that it could more cost effectively produce domestically. The only reason why China spends as much money each year importing more chips than it spends importing oil is because it's so dependent on advanced technologies from abroad. And so long as US firms, Japanese firms, Taiwanese firms, Korean firms can keep a substantial technological edge over Chinese competitors, China will have no choice but to buy from them. But if the gap begins to close or if China ever catches up, we shouldn't expect China to buy any chips from abroad.
Interesting. So Chris, we need to wrap up. So this video pivot, our audience is in the kind of startup community. They're CEOs, founders, entrepreneurs, next generation business leaders. Any final comments about the chip war? Any comments for our viewers?
Well, I would just say that I think the chip war has highlighted the importance of not just software, but also hardware and computing and electronics, and thinking about them symbiotically. Because what we've learned over the past several years is that all of our key advances in terms of AI have depended on computing power, and that means they depend on lots and lots of very advanced semiconductors.
Thank you so much. I learned so much from this conversation. I recommend our viewers to read it's called 半導体戦争, the Japanese version. It's a very big book. And thank you for your time. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah.